Good morning. It's my pleasure to share with you this morning from John chapter 9. And as the service has been proceeding, we've already started to hear some of the story that we're going to look into a little more in detail just now. We've been hearing about a man who had an encounter with Jesus. John tells the story of this man in great detail. It's almost a little bit painstaking, actually, if we really look at the story and experience it as if it was for the first time. And we'd never heard a story about a man named Jesus or a blind man before, and we encountered this story for the first time. We recognize that Jesus is going into, that John, in his retelling of this encounter, is going into a lot of detail. And it's important for us to recognize what has been happening right before this encounter. Jesus and his disciples, and this happens in John chapter 7 and 8, and I'd encourage you to have a look at that maybe later today or this week. Jesus and his disciples have been in Jerusalem, and they've been there because there was a big festival, a religious festival that the Jewish people commemorated every year called the Festival of Shelters or of Tents. And it had a very rich history going back to the days of Moses and the wandering in the wilderness. But the main theme or the focus of that festival had a lot to do with cleansing, the people of God coming to God for cleansing. And that's important for us to just keep in the back of our mind as we move through this story, because it's definitely in the back of the mind of Jesus and his disciples and a lot of other Jewish people who would have encountered the story and this episode because they had just come through the festival themselves. Jesus had been in Jerusalem, and as often the case when he would go to Jerusalem and go to the temple, and as other rabbis of his day did, stand in the courts and teach. And when Jesus went and stood in the courts and teach, we know, those of us who have spent much time reading the scriptures at all, he often got in a lot of trouble there. And this was no different. In John chapter 7 and 8, Jesus makes claims about being the light of the world, makes claims about being living water, teaches in a way that gets the religious leaders very upset. And as a matter of fact, the final verses of chapter 8 tell us that the leaders picked up stones to throw at him right there in the temple yards. They were ready to kill him, stone him, not just the way you might shoo away a wild animal, toss a stone at it. They picked up stones to stone him to death. But the scripture tells us that Jesus got away from them and left the temple and left Jerusalem. And that's everything that he and his disciples had been a part of. As we turn to chapter 9 and say, as Jesus was walking along, might sound like a peaceful stroll, but really, if we have the context that he was getting out of Jerusalem because they were ready to kill him there, it helps us to understand what happens next. As he's walking along, he encounters a man, John tells us, that was blind from birth. Now, blindness was a fairly common ailment in Jesus' time, in antiquity. Blindness or very poor eyesight. They didn't have the same kind of clean running water that we have access to. Infections of the eye. There was no antibiotic drops that you could just go to the store and buy. So infections of the eye and lack of sort of sanitary water made for a lot of eye infections. And so people had very poor eyesight. It was quite common. And eventually even blindness was quite common at earlier ages than we might anticipate it. And Jesus, we know, in every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are stories of Jesus encountering blind people and healing them. And in a lot of other stories where that happens, the people are given a name sometimes. John does not give this man a name. Now, it could very well be that John is telling the story of another time where another gospel writer gave the person a name. We don't really know. And for John, it doesn't really matter because this man was blind. He was blind from birth. That is an aspect of this story that John makes very clear. He didn't get an eye infection. He didn't become blind. He was blind from birth. And John gives the man no name. But again, it's almost awkward when you read the story from beginning to the end. He's constantly referred to as the man, the blind man, the man who was blind from birth, the man, the man, the man. If it was me and I was writing it, I would want to give him a name. But John doesn't. The man's name, the emphasis in John's story is not the man's name. The emphasis is the encounter he had with Jesus. Who he is takes a back seat to all the questions, actually, that get asked about the man. And we're going to look at some of those questions this morning. But I sum them up by saying this. People were having trouble understanding what they were seeing in front of them. And so I called this sermon, "What's This I'm Seeing?" Some of you who know me know that I've had a bit of a challenging year when it comes to eyesight. A little over a year ago, my retina detached, and they fixed that up. And as that was healing, and I was told that would be like a 9-month to 12-month process to see how the vision would return in my right eye. As that was getting better, a cataract was developing in that eye, which made it worse. So until I had the cataract dealt with about a month ago, I really had no idea how clear the vision was going to be in that eye. And that has been coming along well. As a matter of fact, for the past month, I've been walking around with a pair of glasses that has no lens in this side. And this week, that's going to get fixed, and my prescription will be updated, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing the clearest I have seen yet in about 18 months. But for me, in the past year and a bit, I've had a lot of experiences of saying, what is that? What is that I'm seeing? I get a little closer and I look up close. And does anybody else might not even have necessarily eye problems, but sometimes you're just looking at something, you're like, what is that? What is this I'm seeing? And that might be a real physical thing that you have to kind of get a little closer or zoom in on your screen. What is that in that picture? And sometimes it's a bit more of a sort of a metaphorical way we might use that. What is going on here? What is this I'm seeing? What am I looking at? What is unfolding before my eyes? And in this story in John chapter 9 of this man who was born blind, we see a lot of people asking this question, what is this I'm seeing? Although it might not be physically they're having trouble seeing, they're having trouble understanding what's happening in front of their very eyes. The first group of people that have some questions about what might be happening is the disciples themselves. You see, as Jesus and his disciples were walking along the road, they encountered this man who was born blind. And the disciples decide it's time to have a little conversation about this. And they say to Jesus, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "this man who is born blind, why was he born that way? Was it because of sin in his life or sin in his parents' life? Like, why is there this problem of blindness from birth in this man?" You see, blindness because of infection or going blind because you have a problem with your eyes, maybe they could understand that. But why was a person born blind? Is it because of sin in their parents' life or his own life? Now, that may seem a bit of a strange question to us. I mean, a baby being born, we might think, has not had a chance to commit any sins to be punished by their blindness. This is a big theological question that actually comes out of Old Testament scriptures about the sins of the father being handed down to the generations. And there's a theological debate about how to understand even suffering and difficulties and things in our world and in our lives that we might wish were a different way. And so the disciples, when they encounter this man who was born blind, their first question is why? Why did this happen to him? Why do these kinds of things happen? Kind of a theological why or a philosophical why, or just how do we look at the world? How can we understand these kinds of things? Why? Well, Jesus answers their why question, sort of. He says it's not because of sin in his life. It's not because of sin in his parents' life. So they kind of gave Jesus this either or, and Jesus is like, yeah, it's neither. And then he doesn't really go into any more detail about it. Isn't that kind of frustrating, if we're honest? We're like, come on, Jesus, you're the one with the answers. Why did these kinds of things happen? And Jesus is like, the reasons you're thinking, nah, it's neither of those. But if you look at what's going to happen here, you're going to see the way God works. You're going to see the glory of God. You see, Jesus answers to a certain degree, maybe not fully to their satisfaction, the why, but he doesn't let them linger in it too long before he says, even in those situations where you have the why, you need to look to Jesus, look to God and see what is he going to do in these situations. So that's the first question that was kind of brought up about this man. Well, Jesus sees the blind man as the disciples. The story, the way John tells it, the man didn't call out to Jesus, didn't say, hey, come heal me. The disciples pointed him out and said, this man, why is he blind? But when Jesus saw the man who had been born blind, he does something that, again, if we'd never heard this story before, we'd think, ooh, that's a bit weird. He spit on the ground, and he picked up the dirt with his spit in it, turned it into mud, and then spread it on the man's eyes. I was a school teacher in a Christian school for quite a number of years, and we would have Bible classes, and I taught grades 7 and 8, and I remember a day we were talking about this story, and the girls in particular were just grossed out. They were like, I don't know why Jesus would do that. Spit on the ground and then put that on someone's eyes. They just thought it was nasty. And if we're being honest, that might be our response as well. But Jesus smears the mud that he made of his own spit over the man's eyes and says this to him: go to the pool of Siloam, which John wants us to know means sent, and wash that off your eyes. And the man does. He goes right away. Now, the pool of Siloam was a natural spring just outside of Jerusalem that they had irrigated and navigated in such a way that ran into the temple. So the spring was outside of Jerusalem, and they made sure that they irrigated it into the temple. And it was that, using the water from that spring, the pool of Siloam, that they did their cleansing ceremonies during this festival that Jesus had just come from. See, there had been a lot of talk about cleansing, and now Jesus, the first person he encounters who needs something from him, he says, go and wash off the dirt I put on your eyes in the pool of cleansing that I'm sending you to. It means sent. I'm sending you there. Go wash your eyes. So the man goes, and John says he washed it away and he could see. Now, I've gone through a couple of little processes where my vision was really bad, and it gets a little better and a little better, and every time I'm like, thank you, Lord. I can see a little better than before the last process. This man had never seen anything ever. He lived in complete, profound darkness. But when he washed off that dirt, he could see. Well, this is where the questions really start to get interesting, because he comes back. John says, remember, he'd gone to Jerusalem, to the pool of Siloam outside of Jerusalem, and he came back to wherever it was he lived, where Jesus encountered him. And there's hints in this story that was outside of Jerusalem a little ways. Jesus had been walking for a little bit. And when he comes back to where he was from, he encounters his neighbors, people who knew him, and they recognize him, or they think they recognize him, and they're like, isn't this the man who was born blind? Who was a beggar? This is the first time in this story that the man is called a beggar. Now, we know that maybe some of you are already picturing him on the side of the road begging, and probably he was, because that's the only way that blind people could really look after themselves. But John never called him a beggar to start with. It was his neighbors and his friends who identify him as a beggar in John's story and say, isn't this the man who was born blind, who was a beggar? And others would say, well, yes, it looks like him. Oh, but it can't be. He can see now. Well, and they ask him, what's happened to you? And he tells them, Jesus put mud on my eyes, and he sent me to Siloam to wash off. And once I washed it off, I could see! Exclamation point. You're going to notice, maybe you've noticed it as the scripture was on the screens before, every time this man tells the story, I could see, there's an exclamation point. And why wouldn't there be? For the first time ever, he could see. But the neighbors, I think, have a strange sort of, well, what's this I'm seeing approach to this? If it was somebody you knew, and they came to you and told this story, I'm guessing you'd throw a party. At least you'd call someone up and say, come check this out. Let's celebrate somehow. But they were like, oh, this seems strange. You're not the person I thought you were. You see, I had you figured out to be this blind beggar. Remember, it was them who had him identified as the beggar. They knew where he fit in their social strata. And Jesus had done something to change that, and they weren't sure what to make about it. Sometimes Jesus does things to change things, but the way we look at the world, the way we look at each other, the way we look at ourselves. Who are we? Do we have ourselves pegged as a certain thing? And Jesus shakes that up. Well, the neighbors weren't sure. They had questions. How could this be? And so they thought, well, I know what we'll do. We'll go to the Pharisees. We'll take this man to the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, remember, at the end of chapter 8, they just ran Jesus out of Jerusalem. These Pharisees, there were Pharisees in every little worshiping community, so they were just in their own local town, and they went to the Pharisees, and they took the man there, and the Pharisees said to him, what's going on? And the man said, Jesus put mud on my eyes, told me to go to the pool of Siloam. I went there, I washed my eyes, and when I did, I could... Exclamation point, thank you. Tells the Pharisees, wow, this is amazing. What a miracle of God. What a work of God. If someone came into our family of faith we knew, that we'd been worshiping with for years and years, and we'd known, and we heard their story of being healed, wouldn't we be like, praise God for this? But the Pharisees are like, well, what's this I'm seeing? Hang on. This seems a little strange. Is this miracle from God or not? Well, they ask him, and he tells the story, and he says, he was a prophet. He's got to be from God. He healed me. But they were a little hung up on this, because if he really was healed, now follow me here. You gotta follow this trail of logic. This happens sometimes when you're dealing with the Pharisees. If it was from God, if he really was healed, then probably Jesus had miraculous power from God. If Jesus had miraculous power from God, then his mission, his ministry was of God. And if that was true, then they, as people of God, should be embracing Jesus. But this all happened on a Sabbath. Now, this is the first time we're introduced to this in the story, too. This all happened on a Sabbath. And this really hung up the Pharisees. This is the way I love John's storytelling. We didn't know the man was a beggar until the people who had problem with beggars becoming something more than beggars were told what had happened. And we didn't know what happened on the Sabbath until the people who had difficulties with people doing stuff on the Sabbath that they shouldn't do are introduced to the story. But Jesus made mud, which in their mind was work that he shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath. So you could follow the logic to where he might be from God, but then they get to that. So they say, maybe the man was never blind. Maybe this whole thing is just a con. So they say, well, the people who would know for sure if this man was ever blind were his parents. So they call his parents in to see the Pharisees. Now, this is not a comfortable situation. Any children here ever, or maybe as adults, you can look back, been called to the principal's office? I was going to say, there's got to be some people here called to the principal's office at some point in their life. This is similar to this. These people are going about their daily lives, and suddenly they're summoned to go and see the Pharisees. So the Pharisees say, is this your son, and was he actually born blind? They say, yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. But they say, well, then who healed him? And the parents don't want to go any further than that. They say, this is our son. He was born blind. We don't know who healed him. Like, beyond that, we don't really know. He's old enough. He's a grown man. Ask him. Now again, isn't this a strange response in your mind? These are the parents of the man who was born blind. From the first moment this son entered their lives, he had been blind, unable to see. And now he could. Exclamation point. But you don't sense any exclamation point in the parents, do you? John comes right out and tells us they were afraid. They were afraid. Because the Pharisees, who were the leaders of their synagogue, had already made an announcement. They had made known in the bulletin, however it is they'd done that, to say, listen, in this synagogue, we don't believe that Jesus is from God. This man who's been out and about in the countryside doing things, we're not endorsing his ministry, and if you do, you will be kicked out of the synagogue, excommunicated, not allowed to worship here with us anymore. So this man's parents are suddenly in a place where they're like, something really great has happened to our son, but if we go too strongly in here, if we put all our cards on the table, so to speak, and really say, well, Jesus did it, he's from God, then they realize they've got a lot to lose. They've got a lot to lose, and they're afraid. So they're like, he's not a child anymore. He can speak for himself. Let him speak. They couldn't figure out what they were seeing either, because they knew it was going to shake up their world. You see, the Pharisees knew that the way they had figured out how God works was being challenged in Jesus. and they really had a decision to make. Nobody in this story, the neighbors, the parents, the Pharisees, none of them could really see clearly what was going on, could they? It's very interesting that in a story about how nobody could see clearly what was going on was about a man who was blind and now could see. And he and Jesus were the only people who really saw clearly what was going on. You see, Jesus, back in verse 5, when the disciples asked their question about, is this man blind because of his sins or because of his parents' sin, Jesus said to them, listen, we got to look to see where God is working in this, because I've got work to do here, and my work while I'm here on earth is to be the light of the world, to bring light into dark places. And that's exactly what he did with the man when he sent him to be cleansed, is bring light into the darkest of lives who could see nothing. And the man understood what happened, but here's another interesting thing to consider. To this point in our story, this man still had not seen Jesus. He was blind when Jesus sent him away. He came back seeing and had encountered his neighbors and his parents and other people who knew him and the Pharisees, but he hadn't physically with his own eyes seen Jesus yet, but he knew what had happened to him for sure. Well, the Pharisees, as the parents said, when he called him back in and asked him himself, the Pharisees called him back in and they say to him again, what do you think? What's your opinion of this man who healed you? Which is like really ironic, because the reason the neighbors sent him there anyway was to get the Pharisees' expert religious opinion about what was going on. But they're saying to the man, beggar, born blind, the lowest in their society, what do you think? What's your opinion of the man? And he says, well, he's got to be from God. I was blind, and now I can see! Exclamation point. They ask him a few more questions, and he says to them, are you wanting to become his disciple too? Well, that was too much for them. No, we're disciples of Moses. Listen, we know who we follow. We know what the law is. We've got our religion all figured out. We're Moses followers. Nothing wrong with Moses, don't get me wrong, but they had what it meant to be a follower of Moses all figured out. And they, in your English version, probably says something along the lines of kicked him out of the synagogue, and we might think that was like, get out of here, we don't want to talk to you anymore. But the word there that is used is the same word that his parents were worried about, excluded from the family of faith. You see, he'd come out and he'd said what he thought of Jesus. When they asked him, not like his parents who were afraid, he said, oh, I know he's from God. The reason I know it, I was blind and now I can see. If you guys want to be his disciples, you can follow him too. And they excommunicated him. No more was he welcome in this worshiping community, in this family of faith. But he knew what had happened to him. You can hear it over and over and over again as he recounts the story for whatever group of people are there to call him to question. He knew what had happened to him and he knew who had done it. He just hadn't seen him yet with his own two eyes. Well, in verse 35 of chapter 9, it tells us Jesus heard what had happened to the man. And so he goes to see him. And he says to the man, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man answered, who is he? I want to believe him. Now the who is he here might sound like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. What it means is like, where is he? Which one of the people around here is the man who did it? He didn't know what Jesus looked like. And Jesus said, you've seen him. I'm speaking to you. It's me. And the man immediately answers, I believe, Lord. And he began to worship him. Think of all that he'd been through this day. This man got up, went to the side of the road and started to beg like he always did. People come by with some theological, philosophical questions, which Jesus didn't chastise them for asking. He just said, don't linger there in your whys and you're trying to figure it out. Don't let that at least distract you from looking to see what God is doing. Nothing wrong with that, but don't let it keep you from seeing what God is doing. And his neighbors, they don't recognize him. They think, well, he's not what we always thought he was. He might not fit the little box we had him in. The Pharisees, even more worried, God might not fit the little box they had him in. God might be doing something different that they didn't understand. But this man knew that everything was different, and he worshiped Jesus. You see, Jesus says to him, I am the light of the world. And so he said to his disciples, I came to bring light. And to this man, he says this, I entered this world to render judgment. So you see, the kind of light that Jesus shines will render judgment. And that might sound a little harsh, but Jesus goes on to say what he means by that. What he means by that is this, I give sight to the blind. This is how Jesus renders judgment. I give sight to the blind, and I show those who think they can see that they are blind. See, people who can't see, I help them see. And those who think they can see, I show them, you're blinder than you thought you were. Well, guess who was listening when he said that? Our friends, the Pharisees. And they're like, hey, hang on. Are you saying we're blind? Are you talking about us? And Jesus says, if you were blind, you wouldn't even be guilty of it because you were blind. But you remain guilty because you claim you can see. I think lots of times there's a danger for us when we read the stories about the Pharisees and we can say, oh, the Pharisees. But I think it's important also when we read a story like this that the gospel writer goes into such detail of all these different groups and how they encountered this strange thing that they were seeing. And that he wants us to recognize that we all have some darkness in our lives, some shadows, some areas where, to be honest, if Jesus was to shine his pure light there, we might be afraid like the parents. We might get lost in our questions about how does God actually work. Or we might even be worried that God was going to do something that we didn't want God to do. I came across a quote a few years ago by a man, a preacher. He's a pastor in a church in New York and does a lot of writing, and no doubt many of you have read his books or seen things that he has written, named Tim Keller. And he said this, and I wrote it down then because I think I have to remind myself of this. If your God doesn't disagree with you from time to time, you may need to ask yourself if it's possible you aren't really seeking the true living God, but really just an idealized version of yourself. You see, what Jesus did for this man who was born blind that day challenged everybody around with what on earth he was doing. What were they seeing? Because he wasn't behaving in the life of the man, or in the way they saw the world and who fit where, or the way they understood their religion and God himself. Jesus was challenging that. And what Pastor Tim Keller is saying here is if you don't experience that light of Jesus in your life in a way that challenges you, if God doesn't disagree with you from time to time, then you really need to stop and say, am I really seeking Jesus, his light in my life? Or am I comfortable with seeing God, having him all figured out, and really, if I'm honest, he's a really good idealized version of me, or what I think he should be. Or maybe what Moses, my forefathers, thought he should be, or whatever. Truly seeing Jesus, letting him shine his light in our lives, and when he lets us see him, it changes everything. Exclamation point. I hope you experience that, and I hope you don't just look back at a moment in time when you experienced it, but you can say that's an ongoing process in your life, that Jesus comes and cleanses you anew, afresh, opens your eyes, and today you see him, his work, his will for you, his will for those around you, his ability to help you understand who you are, as we sang about earlier, and who he is in a whole new way. And that still fills you with the kind of excitement that John wants us to never lose sight of in this man who had been blind and now can see. This week, ask Jesus to shine his light into your corners, Whether they're really dark corners or they're just a little shadow there, that's between you and God. But he will shine his light. He will cleanse and heal and shine his light, because that's what he came to do.